Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast, Episode 9. My name is Matt Wood, and today we'll hear from Chuck Mansfield of Goldbud Farms. Chuck and his family have been farming high-elevation vineyards in El Dorado County for about 40 years and growing grapes for some of California's greatest wineries. Edmond St. John, Jolie Lade, Tessier, Arno Roberts, Madronia, La Clarine, and many more make amazing wines from their grapes. We'll hear Chuck talk about how his family got started in the region, the diversity of crops that they grow, how Goldbud works with winemakers, some of the soil and geography that makes El Dorado so unique, and the perils of farming in El Dorado, from fires to hail and freezes. I hope you enjoy. Here we go.
Yeah, you can make bad wine from good grapes, but it's very hard to make good wine from bad grapes.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the old adage.
Maybe we could start at the beginning of how your family ended up in El Dorado.
Yeah, so my parents, Ron and Carolyn Mansfield, they met at UC Davis when they were students there in the mid to late 70s. You know, they got married after college. My mom was a high school teacher, and so her first job was in Calaveras County teaching.
Okay.
And, I think during the Davis years, my dad had passed through El Dorado County quite a bit on his way to Lake Tahoe, on kind of college weekends and stuff like that. And the Apple Hill region just really spoke to him. He grew up in Bakersfield. So I think the elevation, the cooler climate, the ability to do tree fruit at a high level because it's not so hot, the access to water was better. He was studying agriculture, so all those things sort of spoke to him. And, he took a job when they were living in Calaveras with the El Dorado Irrigation District, the local water district. They were developing a program that's still in existence today. It's called the IMS program, the Irrigation Management System. It's a very unique program where they put probes, soil moisture probes, in the orchards and in the vineyard blocks. So you get a weekly update on what your actual soil moisture is. So you can really dial in your irrigation inputs. Very unique, very accurate, very useful as a grower. And so my dad and a couple other fresh college grads really dialed in that program for the district. That was kind of the start of him looking to kind of the future of El Dorado County.
And then what year was that when they finally made the move up there?
In 1980. In 1980, my dad became acquainted with a man named Al Finati. Al Finati was an early tech pioneer, a software engineer in the Bay Area. And they purchased a property right in the heart of Apple Hill, which is now the Finati Vineyard, kind of the core of our vineyard operation.
Yeah.
So when Al acquired that property, he hired my dad to be the manager. And we actually, I wasn't born yet. I was born in 1984.
Okay.
So my mom became pregnant with my sister, and they moved into one of the houses on that property in 1980. Yeah.
Was your father originally looking at mostly farming tree fruit, or was viticulture something that he was focused on from the start?
Yeah, so you really can't tell the story of Goldbud Farms or my dad without telling the story of the tree fruit as well. I know it's the Indie Wine Podcast, but the different commodities are definitely key to what Goldbud started as and what it became. So his original vision was really to keep things very small scale. And you have to look back at what the industry was, in the late 70s and the early 80s. Nobody wanted to talk about anything other than Cabernet and Chardonnay. I think even Sauv Blanc would have been considered a fairly eclectic variety. So a totally different landscape. And my dad's vision was high quality tree fruit was always number one. Cherries. He was a pioneer in the California cherry industry. Apples, peaches, plums, nectarines. And he really wanted to have a diverse set of commodities on all the properties he was involved with. And so wine grapes were originally a form of diversity.
Mm-hmm.
Farming at this elevation, the Finati property is at about 2,800 feet of elevation. You're subject to early spring frosts, late season freezes because the winter comes earlier. Hail is always an issue because we're at the base of the Tahoe Basin. So his way to mitigate the risk of farming at a high elevation was to have as much diversity as possible. And so wine grapes fit into that formula.
Keeping that diversity and making sure you always have a crop to sell every year.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to get wiped out on everything.
Yeah.
So the Finati property, it's been farmed since probably somewhere in the 1880s, late 1800s, all the way through the 1900s, through Prohibition. It has a long history of farming. And when my dad arrived, it was, I believe, all Bartlett pears, and then maybe a handful of apples, like maybe Golden Delicious, Red Delicious, some of the old varieties. He pulled pretty much everything out except a handful of pears, a very small number of pear trees, and developed a lot of peach, nectarine, and cherry on the property. And he put in the first vineyards. The first two blocks, one of them was Goldstraminer for Madronia Winery.
Mm-hmm.
And the second block was Syrah.
Okay.
So Syrah would have been considered very eclectic variety at the time, as would Goldstraminer. But some of the aromatic, Germanic varieties, there was a little traction with Riesling and some of those early on in the 60s and 70s. But Syrah, there was hardly any Syrah in the state. There was hardly any Grenache, Mourvedre, literally 2-3 acres here or there.
Do you know what made him think about planting those varietals?
Yeah, so his original vision, which we've actually still kind of grown and matured and carried forward to today, was to have sort of a yin and yang of working with a production winery on one block and then maybe having some other blocks that would go to home winemakers.
Okay.
His original idea was that home winemakers are going to buy obviously much less fruit, but they'll pay a higher price per pound or per ton because they're getting less. Mm-hmm. The commercial wineries would take more tonnage, but they were going to pay less per ton. So to him, it was another way to kind of diversify your client base and create a little more stability in the farming. So that Syrah was actually originally planted just for local home winemakers in El Dorado County.
Do you have any idea how many commercial wineries were in the area at the time? I know there's like Madronia and Boger and
yeah. So Boger was the first, and then you had Madronia, Sierra Vista were shortly after, and so those were the big three. We started developing the Lava Cap winery in the early 80s. I think the story goes that I was just born when we started planting that vineyard for the Jones family. So that would have been around 84. That Lava Cap was put in the ground. So there weren't a lot. There were a lot of agriculturalists that grew, apples, pears. Those were kind of the king commodities in El Dorado County at the time. And there was a lot of what we would call semi-pros or garagists that made a good amount, maybe flirted with the legal tax-free minimum.
Sure, okay.
And so that was a big part of the market in El Dorado County at that time.
At that time, Goldbud was sometimes helping plant vineyards and farm them. And also, did you own any vineyards at the time?
So my dad did not own any vineyards at the time. In the mid-'80s, he bought a property in the Fairplay region and developed that with the idea he would sell it. And that became the Oakstone Winery, which burnt down. Mm-hmm. And it's still farmed today. It's just a vineyard. I don't think they've rebuilt the facility or completed it yet. It has new owners. But that was the first property that he bought and owned. And he used the proceeds from that to purchase the Goldbud property, the property I'm sitting in now, a 10-acre property on Carson Road. And so that would have been his first purchase, and that would have been in the mid-'80s.
Percentages of the tree fruit versus wine grapes, how has that changed over time?
In the early days, so those first two blocks at Finati would have been the only wine grapes until the Joneses came along. and then he planted a few more vineyards out in the Gold Hill region. So in the early days, I'd say the percentage was probably 80% tree fruit, 20% wine grapes, and we're probably nowadays about 60% wine grapes and 40% tree fruit. Some of that is attrition on the orchards as they've aged. They don't have the same lifespan as a vineyard.
Mm-hmm.
Their productive life is shorter, but we've also developed some estate wineries, so that acreage has increased on the vineyard side.
What's been your story? How did you get involved in the family business?
Yeah, so growing up on the Finati property was a wonderful way to grow up. There was the house we lived in was a little 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom house. There was another 2-in-1 foreman house, and then a 6-bedroom vineyard employee house. So the Garcia family had the other foreman house. Checky Garcia came from Mexico to work with my dad in the very early 80s when he was first starting. So Checky came with his wife, Anna, and he had 5 children. And I was right in the middle, age-wise, of those 5 kids. So my sister, myself, and then the 5 Garcia kids, we had 7 kids growing up on this property. And we were best of friends, and it was just such a wonderful way to grow up. We had such a connection to that ranch. When we weren't in school, we were either playing on the ranch, or we would, my dad kind of, to teach me the value of $1, would put me out with the crew for whatever I could stand, even as a young age, whether it was an hour or 2 hours. And that slowly and steadily grew. And when you got to summer breaks in high school, I enjoyed being out with the field guys, learning Spanish, sharing lunches, just exchanging the culture and all that, and became very close to them. Working in the vineyards, I always enjoyed the cycle of the vines. It just spoke to me. So it was something I just decided to study, and I always wanted to come back and work with my dad at some point. After my education, I took jobs to try to gain more experience elsewhere, with the idea that I'd bring that back and try to make Goldbud a little more well-rounded.
Where were some of the other places you worked before coming back to Goldbud?
So I did. I withdrew from Cal Poly for 1 semester and went to Australia, and I worked for a winery called Scotchman Hill outside of Melbourne. So that would have been my first job outside of El Dorado County. And then after graduating from Cal Poly, my first job was with Gallo in Modesto.
Okay.
And so I was more on the winemaking side, but I was in a role where I interfaced with some of the vineyard teams to produce small research wines. So I would get directives from winemakers or food scientists. Maybe they wanted to do a ripeness trial.
Okay.
Let's pick this Sauv Blanc vineyard, every day for 30 days and make the wine the same way and see how it tastes.
Okay.
So projects along those lines. So that was a wonderful experience there. And after my stop in Gallo, I went to Sonoma County, and I worked with the Hopkiln Winery on West Side Road.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, to redevelop their 100 acres. They have a 250-acre ranch. They now have 100 acres of vines that myself and another Cal Poly grad, Dave Smith, that we put in together on that property.
Great. So that's kind of your first sort of solo, or I guess nearly solo vineyard project. Yeah,
nearly solo. I wouldn't have been able to do it without Dave. He grew up in Cloverdale. Very well experienced, well-rounded individual. So it was a very fun project to be a part of in my 20s. Learned a lot, but it was kind of the first project that I was outside of the purview of my dad. Yeah.
So then you made your way back and started working alongside him?
That's right. Yeah. So that would have been 2015. I returned back to Goldbud Farms for the harvest of 2015.
Are you able to tell me some of the kind of defining characteristics of El Dorado, from the topography to the soil? And I feel like it's some of the highest vineyards in the state in elevation. Yeah. So the elevation is key. The most interesting thing about El Dorado County is oftentimes its best blessings can also be its greatest challenges.
With elevation and pushing the limits of agriculture, on mountain slopes, it comes with setbacks, and sometimes those can be pretty tough, like the frost we experienced last year, where we lost basically almost all the fruit. But when it works out well, what we find is that our elevation bud break is significantly later than Napa, Sonoma, certainly than the Valley. Shifting that growing season later, it allows you to hit veraison on a lot of varieties when the sun angle is lower in the sky. The days are getting shorter.
Okay.
And so what we find, especially on varieties like Grenache or Gamay Noir, sensitive varieties, that Brix buildup is significantly slower than other areas. Even in El Dorado County, Grenache at 1,000 feet elevation, the grapes are going to hit veraison and start to ripen when that sun angle is still high. The daytime highs are still very hot. And so the variety will have a tendency to jump from 20 to 24 Brix in an instant.
Okay.
And that can pose a challenge to really get full physiological ripeness and really build that depth of flavor and tannin development in the wines. So when we push the elevation higher, we can really sit back and watch that Brix build much slower, a 1/10, 2/10 per day. And the harvest decisions can be based much more around textures and flavors and not so much about the bottom dropping out of the acid and the sugar spiking through the ceiling. So you're really able to dial in the style of any given wine.
So you're able to spread out those picks for what each winemaker is looking for because of that slower Brix development.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's also wonderful in an environment where labor is difficult because you have many more days to harvest what's out there instead of feeling this rush to get everything off the vine and delivered. It's the end product, can be the goalpost and not so much the logistics or the chemistry.
What are most of the soils that you're farming?
So the two main choice soils that I look for in the Apple Hill region at the higher elevations, we start to see a volcanic clay loam soil called Aiken clay loam. It's basically if you took the Hawaiian red modeling clay and those black lava rocks that everybody's familiar with that are iconic in Hawaii. If you weathered those for millions of years, so you're left with the kind of microgranular pebbles from that lava rock mixed with that Hawaiian clay, so it's not so slick.
Okay.
It has more of a loamy texture. That's the main soil we look for. It's predominant in Apple Hill. It has wonderful soil moisture holding abilities. So once we get vineyards fully established and the root zones fully developed, we can dry farm quite a few different varieties. The sites of the varieties where dry farming is not a reality, the number of irrigations are usually not more than 2 per season.
Okay.
So the farming is very different than what you see in Napa and Sonoma, where in their soils they're constantly spoon feeding the vines water every few days. We look to do maybe 1 or 2 big irrigations, and that's it for the season.
Okay.
The second set of soils would be the granite-driven soils, the decomposed granite. And when we're at the lower elevations in the Gold Hill region of El Dorado County, so that's 1,000 to 1,800 feet elevation, we see a lot of decomposed granite sites that, if you can picture that, your high school running track, that kind of white granite surface, it's essentially that soil. So much more coarse, much sandier, much more well-drained. So that's where you do have to irrigate a little more frequently, but not nearly as much as what they're doing in the valley. So maybe those we irrigate every 2 or 3 weeks, and then we're able to kind of cut that off a few weeks before harvest. Those soils, the two different soils really have a big impact on the tannin structure of the wines is where I really, really notice it. The granite soils, they're going to give you a really granular, more present tannin structure, a higher tannin count. So they're a little more present. The clay soils, they're a little more resolved. They're rounded, a little more kind of a cedar type of a texture. And so for me, it's really they can be blended together to create a really, really amazing rounded profile, or they can be kept separate to really showcase the differences. And so we have winemakers that like to handle things both ways.
What do your farming practices tend to be? Is most of your farming Lodi rules or organic or mixture or other practices?
Yeah, it's a mixture. And a lot of times we custom farm to the client, to their core values. We're always trying to find every little bit of quality we can eke out. So we're not at Goldbud, we're not dogmatic about any core belief system other than the base. Our standing operating procedure would be what we would call an integrated pest management program, an IPM program. We try to take the best practices from organic, and we try to take the best practices from conventional when needed, and we will use those. But a lot of our clients, where not using any synthetics is a core value. Many of our properties, we've kind of gone that direction to meet those core values. And I do believe that one day organic farming will just kind of be the price of admission. And so we've kind of steadily crept that direction, really just to be able to perfect it and maintain the level of quality and standards that we have. So I'd say over the past 10 years, we've gone from everything being conventional to now, last vintage, we probably did more than half of our properties with no synthetic fertilizers or fungicides.
Okay.
I will say another advantage of El Dorado County is the insect pest pressure is significantly less than any other region that I've been involved with. So I can count on one hand the number of times where a insecticide has been necessary on a vineyard. It's very rare in El Dorado County.
Yeah, I was going to ask what the pest and disease pressure is like for you in general.
Yeah, so mildew pressure is at a maximum in El Dorado. People always think of Pinot Noir and Sonoma County being a challenge, and it is. But at our elevation, we don't really see a lot of daytime highs above 100. Mm-hmm. We don't see a lot of nighttime lows that get as cold as say Sonoma County on the True Coast and that sort of thing. So we are always kind of in this mildew pressure weather. So that's going to be your number one challenge in a vineyard in El Dorado County. But we've found great results handling that without synthetics, just by using sulfur judiciously early in the season. And then we've been able to use organic crop oils through the growing season. If you stay on top of your cultural work, manage your canopy, and manage those organic materials judiciously, you can mitigate that pretty easily.
Do you farm certain rows kind of custom for certain wineries?
Yeah, so every block, once we assign a destiny to it, and we know what winemaker it's going to, then I encourage as much involvement from the winemaker as possible. And so the 10-acre property here at Goldbud Farms would be a great example of that. We have 4 different blocks of Grenache. They're all quite small. And so, yeah, we'll be doing something different in Helen Keplinger's block compared to maybe Bertus von Ziel at Tank Garage. We'll custom farm and do the canopy management in a way that, because we're ultimately farming the wine. And so if somebody wants more exposure and more ripeness and more resolution in those tannins, we'll try to drive that in the vineyard first. If someone's making a rosé or the style of the wine is different, we're going to farm for that end goal. So it absolutely is an ongoing conversation through the season. I encourage the winemakers to be in our vineyards as much as possible so they understand where everything's at and how we can best accomplish their goals for them. How
many winemakers are you working with on a given year? Must be quite a few at this point.
Yeah, it's a long list. Man, I think I sent out at least 40 different invoices. Okay. So it could be 40 to 50 winemakers, I think.
And how many properties are you farming?
We do. I think we have maybe 8 different vineyards.
Okay.
This year that we're signed up to manage, and they range in size. We have one that's quite small, that's only 2.5 acres. Another one that's like 3.5 acres. And then we have quite a few that are 30-acre or more properties. Yeah.
I know you grow a lot of, there's the Syrah, Grenache, Mourvedre, and can you give me some of the other varieties that you're growing?
Yeah, so like I said, it started as just Syrah and Gewürztraminer at the Finati property. And after 2 or 3 years is when my dad met Steve Edmonds, and he started working with the Syrah from Finati. Bill Easton was involved early on. And when those two tasted Steve's first Finati Syrah, I think they really were struck with how similar to Côte Rôtie wines it was. Mm-hmm. So that spurred a little bit of Viognier being added to the mix to try to chase some of those Côte Rôtie style wines.
Okay.
The next evolution was into the rest of the Rhones. So Steve Edmonds early on had lost access to some Grenache and Mourvedre that was on Mount Veeder, one of the earliest Grenache and Mourvedre plantings in the state. Mm-hmm. So my dad planted some Sauv Blanc and Mourvedre in the Gold Hill region. The Sauv Blanc actually was for Bogle Winery.
Okay.
And Bogle was quite small at the time, was just starting. And we've steadily grown and been supplying Bogle every year. And we are Bogle Winery's longest tenured grower.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So the California staple varieties, Cabernet, Merlot, Chardonnay, those all were added bit by bit, sometimes for Bogle, sometimes for Lava Cap, Madronia, a lot of the local wineries. We grew with those businesses, but my dad always kind of stuck with that philosophy of working part with established commercial wineries, but always looking to the future with small, newer producers. And at the time, Steve Edmonds, Bill Easton, they were exactly that. So some of those Rhones started getting into the mix, and it just steadily grew. And now we have all the Rhone varieties. It's us and Tablas Creek, I believe, are the only two.
Oh, you have everything now.
We do. I have a handful of vines, literally a handful of some of the Chateauneuf blenders that Donkey and Goat in Berkeley that they work with. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we have a wonderful relationship with Tablas Creek, and we've been in love with their clonal material. So that was sort of the next way it proliferated once there was access to more clone selections within Grenache and Mourvedre. Goldbud started diversifying along those lines as well.
You have some Gamay planted also that's pretty popular, I think.
Yeah, so Gamay was another variety that Steve Edmonds pushed my dad to plant. He would bring some of these back from France. We'd get them at Kermit Lynch, and we, at some of the dinners, mm-hmm. post-harvest dinners we would have, we would try some of these wines. But, you couldn't find it in the States. There was Val de Guillet, there was Napa Gamay, mm-hmm. Right. But it's not true Gamay. And I believe that Nova Vine got access to the first Gamay, and they got it through quarantine. And we planted that first selection of Gamay at the Witters Vineyard, which is at 3,500 feet elevation. Wow. So it's one of the highest vineyards that there is. Now that vineyard, it will freeze at least 1 out of 4 years, if not every other year.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So that was a decision my dad and Steve made along with Bob Witters when he acquired that property. And they really wanted to push the limits of viticulture in California. They put an early variety in a very, very freeze-sensitive spot. But the goal was always, like I described earlier, to be able to have it in a site that we knew was very rarely gonna get into the mid-90s temperature-wise. And it's on the clay Aiken loam soil that I described. When you taste those grapes on the vine, the depth of flavor, the succulence, the juiciness, the austere acidity on the side of the tongue, the concentration of that fruit is just so delicious. When we're harvesting, you have to really work hard to keep your, to keep your nose out of the bin. And so when that site comes through, drama-free from Mother Nature, the wines are amazing. And so Steve that's been the core of his Bone Jolly red Gamay and rosé since the late 90s when it was planted. We've added some other clients over the years. So Arno Roberts is pretty heavily invested in that site. And when the crop load comes through at a normal, 2 tons per acre level, then Scott Schultz at Jolie Lade will get an allocation, and Chris Pittenger at Grove Vaughn. He's made some amazing Gamay Noirs over the years as well.
Yeah, the Gamay grown up there is really lovely. There's some great wines from it.
Yeah, and it's, all these varieties are fun. So early on with the Witters vineyard, Steve, I tasted some of his early wines and they were incredible. But nobody had heard of Gamay Noir. I was at Cal Poly at the time, and I had a job at Big Sky Cafe, which was a wonderful restaurant, had a great wine selection, and the owner there gave me the opportunity to make a Nouveau, a Gamay Nouveau off of that vineyard. Very fun project. So we actually took all the second crop.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I fermented the second crop. We made a Gamay. We put it in keg and brought it to the restaurant and served it by the glass. And we revitalized, the Nouveau category. It was an amazingly deep wine. The second crop has so much acid, but you still, when you get it ripe to that 21 bricks level, you can make such a concentrated Gamay. We actually have a handful of winemakers that prefer to work with the second crop for that reason. And the wines are just absolutely luscious.
Really? That's one of the things I notice about a lot of the wines made from your vineyards is that they taste fully ripe, but at super low alcohol levels.
So that's where the elevation comes into play. Getting physiological ripeness is just so important. And to me, people being dogmatic about bricks levels is what leads you to that quote unquote parkerization of wines. It's if the vineyard manager and the winemaker are going to play couch commander and just wait for the chemistry to roll in and make picking decisions purely on bricks and pH, then you really have no choice but to err on the side of ripeness. We try to go the opposite direction. We try to be ahead of the curve. If you have a really cold summer and you don't get a lot of heat, you probably need to start thinking about thinning the crop a little more aggressively, a little earlier, so that when you go through the veraison process, your vine is already in balance. And what we find is even in those challenging years, if you manage your crop load, you manage your canopy, you're going to get a depth of flavor no matter what the conditions are through veraison and leading up to harvest.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about growing white grapes also in El Dorado.
Yeah, so white grapes, I was having this conversation with Paul Bush at Madronia recently because, him and I, we have a similar palate. We seem to like a lot of the same wines. And him and I have geeked out over various white wines. They've made some amazing dry Rieslings, aromatic varieties, and he's been able to master, wines, maybe Chenin Blanc, things, varieties that people think of as sweet. He's been able to eliminate that sweetness and keep the wines deep and compelling. And I've always liked that about their wines. But we always think it would be amazing if people realized what you could do at low bricks and with white wines in El Dorado County. I think a lot of the connotation is around big, jammy Zins and powerful reds. But we would love the wine world to realize, and ultimately maybe El Dorado County could be known for its white wines. You put the right variety at the right site and you manage the crop load and the irrigation practices correctly, and the resulting wines can be so deep, so concentrated. Steve Edmonds makes the Heart of Gold wine. It's Vermentino and Grenache Blanc from the Finati property. And I'll tell you, in the summertime, there's no way you can have just one glass of that wine. It's almost impossible. It's so alluring aromatically and so deep and succulent. It's so hard to take the glass away from your lips when you take that first sip. And a lot of the white wines, when they're mastered in this area, they have a depth to them that few other regions have been able to match.
Do you find yourself having to change either trellising or farming practices, or even grapes planted with climate change and things like that happening?
Yeah, it would seem we've experienced, some oscillations with the weather. My perspective is so small because I was born in 1984, but like this year we had 2 snows of 4 feet here at the office, the snowiest year since the 50s. And they're saying the second snowiest year since there's been reliable records. Last year, most of the state experienced that devastating heat wave. We were blessed at our elevation. Mm-hmm. It didn't hit that hard. It didn't even hit 100 once you were above 2,000 feet. But with the wildfires, some of these extremes, I think we experiment constantly. We hope winemakers show us the worst wine first so we can try to understand how to get better. We've gone to our vertical cordon system. We've taken, the traditional head trained method. We like the vertical cordon with a lot of the big berry varieties like Grenache, Mourvedre, big cluster, big berry varieties. We feel we can control the exposure to the sun a little more easily than the traditional VSP methods, where you kind of, leaf the fruit zone wide open on the morning sun side. That used to seem to work fine, but you can overexpose the grapes. So we're experimenting with leaving longer spur positions on the top of the vine, would be an example, so that we have sort of 4 or 5 canes that we use not so much for fruit load, but for the ability to retain shade until we no longer need it. Then we can come back and leaf or remove laterals, things of that nature to re-expose the fruit. So for us, it's hard work, it's expensive, it's extra passes, but we come from a world of ultra high-end tree fruit where that's par for the course. Mm-hmm. So to compete in the area of the marketplace we do with tree fruit, it's the same sort of work ethic and diligence and tenacity. And we carry that over to the vineyard. And so we can mitigate some of those issues, I believe, moving forward.
How have the fires affected you? The Caldor fire, I guess, is probably the big one out there in the last couple of years.
Yeah, so the Caldor fire was, it was absolutely devastating for El Dorado County. 2020, I'll tell you, the fruit that was hanging on the vine in 2020 was absolutely amazing. A couple days before the Caldor fire started, I was with Arnaud Roberts walking the Gamay, and I don't even think we said a word because we were just tasting the fruit, and it was just smiles and and you knew all you had to do was get it on the truck and get it to the winery. The Delfino family, they've been making some amazing wines at their new vineyard on North Canyon, Delfino Farms. Edio Vineyards was the same thing. We were just about to pick some Chenin Blanc for a sparkling project that they were doing. And, if you've ever played a lot of craps at the casino, that's what it felt like to me when there were big stacks of chips on the middle of the table, but then the casino's rake just kind of came and took it all off the table, cleared it all out. It was one of the most demoralizing emotional experiences I went through when we woke up to like a 400 or 500 AQI day.
Right.
And I went to lunch with my dad that day, and he was sitting there eating a hamburger, and it was almost like he didn't care. It was just washing right over him. And I said, Dad, how are you able to enjoy this lunch? And he looked at me and he said, do you know how many times I lost the entire cherry crop in my career? And I said, no. And he said, son, I lost the cherry crop more times than I got it. So he's been through so much more than any of us. He's lost apple crops. He's lost peach crops. And in that moment, I remember being young and just seeing him cry as hail and rain came down when the cherries were a day or two away from being harvested. So it's always been a part of agriculture, the crushing setbacks. What's different is we've had 3 of them in a row with the mosquito fire and then last year's freeze. So,
Okay.
But I believe that through that, you can come out stronger. The wineries, they're struggling a little bit. They went through COVID, which completely shook up the marketplace. Some of them were able to hustle and grind and reach direct to consumer and find ways to actually sell more wine. And so what I've found through this cycle we've been through, I've really found which winemakers have the moxie, have the grit, have the effort to kind of walk through this dark period and keep their focus on the light at the end of the tunnel. So in agriculture, you can choose to resign yourself and just give up. Or you can choose to let the winter kind of sanitize, clear the chalkboard and get back up and start over in this spring and hope that it's not going to be the same as the last. Because every year is different. And so that's what we've chosen to do is learn from those experiences and try to come back with a more galvanized relationship with our clients.
Never know what Mother Nature has in store.
She's the boss.
Yeah. You're pretty instrumental in being able to get people with agricultural plots back in after the fires, right? Like the permit process and everything.
Yeah. So in the early days of the Caldor emergency, we had received permission from CHP, California Highway Patrol, to harvest the Witters Vineyard. So the Witters Vineyard was in the evacuation zone by less than a quarter mile.
Okay.
CHP had set up a barricade literally at the driveway entrance. So we arrived with a harvest crew, 2 tractors, a truck with all the bins at about 4 a.m. at the checkpoint. And the CHP guard had been relieved by the sheriff's office, and the sheriff's office wouldn't let us in to harvest. We ended up losing that entire crop.
Oh, wow.
So that was a big emotional blow, a big financial blow. So I came back to the office and kind of licking my wounds. And so I picked up the phone. I called a friend of mine that used to be in the state Senate, and he gave me Sheriff D'Agostini's phone number and email. And so I just wrote the sheriff a message, and I copied some of the other people who were instrumental in local government. And to his credit, the sheriff called me back, and he said, I'd like to give agriculturalists a pass to be escorted in and out of these zones. He assigned a lieutenant to meet with the Board of Supervisors. And yeah, we crafted a program. And we think that certainly many hundreds of thousands of dollars of grapes were salvaged. Many farm workers were able to go in and get a paycheck because a lot of them were out of their home.
Right.
No home, no paycheck. It's already a difficult life for a lot of those people. So, they don't want to sit back and watch the crops go to waste after they worked all year on those vineyards. So yeah, we put a program in place that was pretty successful, and the state is actually looking at scaling that program up to create some standards and some definitions so that other counties can recreate that program.
That's great. I was going to ask if the program is still continuing on, but it sounds like it is.
Yeah, and I should give credit to Chris Pittenger. He's the winemaker at Limerick Lane and has his own label, Grove On. He called and suggested that Sonoma County had that program during their emergencies on a small scale for cattle. So we El Dorado emulated some of the best parts of Sonoma County's program, and so it's scaling up, and it seems like a promising program.
Do you see any evolution in the future for agriculture or viticulture in El Dorado? Ways that it's changing at all?
I think, climate impacts, these wildfires. I'm hoping government is making changes in some of sort of the emergency response and forest management that's going to help us be more resilient and mitigate some of those major disasters. But I think agriculture always has to evolve. You can look back at episodes like the Dust Bowl, other disasters, human caused or nature caused. It's always been a part of agriculture. And so, what we're doing, we're always looking for different varieties, different cultural techniques, anything that we can do to make our plants more resilient, or to up our game, finding new wine styles, new things in the cellar that can mitigate some of these smoke damage issues. Bertus von Ziel at Tank Garage has done some ripasso techniques where he takes clean skins from other wines and rehydrates them with smoke damaged wines. And I've tasted some pretty impressive trials.
Okay, interesting.
Viticulture and enology is a unique discipline in that academia tends to study what's being done in practice to explain it in terms of science, as opposed to, say, the pharmaceutical industry where everything comes out of research in academia before the product. It's almost the opposite. And so I believe that innovation is always going to start in the vineyard and in the cellar. And we're going to figure out what works, and then we'll let the academics figure out why that is, and then refine the techniques from there once they understand what's happening.
Great.
I really just want to encourage, consumers, wine writers, everybody to kind of, Mike Dunn's been so far ahead of the curve. He's spent so much time in the foothills, and he has such great command of the players and the wines that are being made up here. And he's known for ages that the Sierra foothills are more than just big, heavy reds. There's really some amazing local wine makers, local wineries. The younger generation at Lava Cap is taking over. I mentioned the Delfino family with decades of farming experience, their winery. There's so many local wines that are compelling, and they're just completely different than what the connotation of the area is out there. I just would encourage people to come experience the countryside and the wines, and you're going to find a lot of small family owned operations. It's going to, a lot of times the winemaker is going to be in the tasting room pouring the wine, and you can have conversations and get a deep education just like this. And you're not going to find that in a lot of other areas.
I really enjoy the wines from El Dorado. Just wines that you love to drink.
Yeah, like I say, some of them, it's very hard to put the glass down once you pick it up. Everything starts in the vineyard, and we love the type of winemakers that are going to be out there and involved in every decision along the way. It keeps it personal. It keeps the quality higher, in my opinion, and it makes the wines that much more fun to drink when we get to that point.
Thanks for listening to our conversation with Chuck. You can really hear the passion for El Dorado in his voice. I'd invite you to pick up some wines made from El Dorado fruit next time you're at your local wine shop. You can follow the podcast and subscribe on wherever you're listening, and also follow the Instagram at Indie Wine Podcast for updates, or email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with questions or comments or suggestions. Our next episode will be with Randy Caparoso, a man of many hats, wine writer, sommelier, photographer, author, etc. We'll be discussing his storied career, Lodi wine growing, and his book, Lodi, the definitive guide and history of America's largest wine growing region. Thanks again. Have a good one.